Sometimes love hurts. This is something we all know, and yet we spend an awful lot of time and effort trying to deny it. But this hurt is not distributed evenly. We all know people who continually get badly hurt in their quest for love. They seem to fall into the same painful relationship patterns over and over again. They become obsessive, they torment themselves, they fall into despair, and then they get up and do it all over again. From the outside, it can seem like they've gone mad. But they are not mad. They are suffering from what Dorothy Tenov calls limerence. This word has become more popular in recent years, and today we are going to look at what it is, why it makes love so painful, and whether we can harness it for good. This is something of a sequel to the video I made about a year ago on crushes, and we will be covering some of the same material. But fear not, if you have watched that video, then there is still plenty of new stuff to sink your teeth into. And let's begin by dispelling a persistent myth about love and about limerence, that we should expect our feelings to be rational or reasonable. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. The irrationality of limerence. For better or for worse, we live in a culture that praises rationality and moderation in decision-making. This tradition stretches at least as far back as Plato, and probably well before him. Generally speaking, we are taught two things about human moral psychology, for lack of a better word, as part of our underlying value system. The first is that to be more rational is always better, and the second is that through careful practice and discipline, we can eliminate irrationality from our psyche. These lessons are not always explicit. They often just hum away in the background of our viewpoint. We see them rear their heads when we tell someone that they are blowing things out of proportion by their strong emotional reaction to something. We treat them like they are doing something wrong because we treat reason as if it can and should totally master the passions, and thus this person is falling short in some way when they allow their emotions to get the best of them. I'm certainly not saying that this idea is generally a bad thing. I do think that through careful management, we can slowly alter our instinctive reactions to be more in line with what we consider rational and what we consciously and deliberately desire as opposed to instinctively desire. And in fact, this will form an important point later in the video. However, I also think this picture of the human being means that we sometimes overlook the absolutely staggering amount of strong, undeniable irrationality baked into us from the start. And this irrationality is absolutely evident in the phenomenon of limerence. Tenov defines limerence as a kind of emotionally uncontrollable romantic obsession that many of us can develop for people. Sometimes when people talk about limerence, they treat it as some kind of aberrant phenomenon, something that only an emotionally unstable person would possibly feel. However, Tenov's book is notable because it treats limerence as a perfectly ordinary part of human behavior for a large majority of human beings. As she puts it, what my studies suggest is that while limerence is illogical, it is also normal, and therefore normal human beings can be illogical. For some, this seems a difficult idea to accept. All of this is to say that if, like myself, you are somewhat prone to limerence, this doesn't mean that you have something irreparably wrong with you. Limerence is a perfectly regular human emotion, and although, as we will definitely see, it can cause suffering, and that suffering is often tied up with limerence's irrationality, it makes no sense to beat ourselves up for failing to live up to an expectation that we should be perfectly rational. We are not, we never have been, and we certainly never will be. That being said, for Tenov, irrationality is at the heart of the limerent experience. It emerges and re-emerges a number of times in her book at various different levels and aspects of limerence. Firstly, Tenov focuses on the irrationality of how we perceive the person we feel limerence for, or our limerent object in her terminology. Tenov draws from, well, one of my favourite authors, the great French writer Stendhal, to describe the process by which we transform an ordinary person into some kind of romantic demigod or demigoddess in our minds. It comes in a few stages. The early stages of limerence are characterized by a simple physical attraction towards someone that is pleasant in valence. You may notice that their hair looks nice today, or you catch yourself glancing at them when you're distracted. This is so far only the potential for limerence. The limerence properly begins when you start to dwell primarily on the positive aspects of the limerent object and reframe or neglect the negative ones, which incidentally will include any and all qualities that inform you that this person is probably not a great fit for you. But of course, sometimes it is vitally important to get an accurate picture of the world around you, which is why I recommend today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Every story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on their reporting on the recent deal reached between Cornell University and the Trump administration. Whereas left-wing sources framed this in negative terms, saying that the administration had withheld funds, right-wing sources emphasized the perceived responsibility of the university and generally framed things in a more positive manner. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs. I just don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every article I read for bias. So, receiving my Ground News roundup at the end of every day means I can get a variety of news opinions, learn which sources are trustworthy, and just generally make the world less of a bewildering mess. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. They've genuinely become my go-to news source, and I sincerely hope that you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. This process will be easily recalled by absolutely anyone who has been through it. You find your attention drawn towards a coworker or a fellow uni student or a friend or an acquaintance, and then gradually your image of them begins to shift. You find yourself unwittingly exaggerating all of the things that you admire about them. Their smile is not just lovely, it's dazzling. Their jokes are not just amusing, they're hilarious. They're not just quite bright, but extraordinarily clever. And something strange begins to happen with what you would have called their negative qualities, personality flaws that only a few weeks ago you would have been able to see clearly and identify, now appear either fuzzy or insignificant. That moment when they were deeply unkind to someone now appears in your mind like a small and grainy memory, whereas the time that they stepped in to help a friend in need is glittering and vivid in all its detail. It isn't that you can't see the things that might make this person bad for you, but you almost can't bring yourself to care about them. One of Tenov's interviewees puts this wonderfully. I decided to make a list in block letters of everything about Elsie that I found unpleasant or annoying. It was a very long list. On the other side of the paper, I listed her good points. It was a short list, but it didn't help at all. The good points seemed so much more important, and the bad things, well, in Elsie, they weren't so bad, or they were things I felt I could help her with. Stendhal calls this tendency crystallization, and we did discuss it a little bit in the video on crushes. However, in this video, I want to bring out just how likely this is to cause us to end up with someone who is, on balance, quite likely to hurt us. If we exaggerate someone's positive qualities and view their negative ones as insignificant, then of course we will tend to miss all those aspects of them that would let us know how upsetting they could be, either for us or just in general. Or rather, we will see these qualities, but we won't be able to register their significance. This is only anecdotal, but myself and a number of my friends have all at one point or another ended up in relationships that were really quite awful to be in. They weren't abusive or anything like that, but they were clearly making each of us deeply unhappy. Long after those relationships ended, I asked them all if they knew in advance that the relationships would be unpleasant. And something that surprised me is that most of them confessed that they did. They knew about incompatibility X or obstacle Y. But at the same time, such things just seemed unimportant to them. They were there, but they weren't really there, if that makes sense. It reminds me of one of Schopenhauer's explanations of the reproductive drive, where he discusses all the ways that it deceives and falsifies our perceptions and judgments. Schopenhauer almost treats it as demonic. It blinds us, it twists our senses like a malevolent hypnotist or a cruel manipulator. And it is easy to see how such a mechanism might both cause unhappiness and also be evolutionarily selected for. This distortion in perception thus seems absolutely key to how we end up loving or desiring people who will end up hurting us. And more than that, desiring these people even when we are, at some level, fully aware that they will probably hurt us. It's not exactly a win for human being as rational animal. And I might go one step further than Tenov does here, at least in her book, and argue that the reasons we feel limerent towards someone might be pretty opaque to us, and also may not be as noble as we often think. To take an example from Stendhal, his protagonist in The Red and the Black, Julien Sorel, has two great limerent escapades, and whether Sorel himself is aware of it or not, they are clearly sparked and kept alive by much more than just innocent amorous attraction. Sorel is low-born, and although he comes to carve out some social status for himself in the world, the heights of aristocratic regard are forever closed off to him. By managing to seduce two noble-born women, he also asserts his dominance over a social system that consistently tells him that he is beneath regard by virtue of his birth. It's not clear that Sorel is fully aware of this motivation, and he's certainly not fully aware of it at all points. But Stendhal, in his writings, makes it more than apparent. I wonder how often our own limerent attractions towards people stem similarly from some mysterious semi-conscious or unconscious source. It doesn't help that once we are limerent for someone, Tenov points out we place an absurdly, one might even say irrationally, outsized importance on whether they feel the same way about us. And this feeling is surprisingly impervious to even outright cruelty on the part of the limerent object. This is yet another way in which the feeling is totally or irrational, even sometimes to the point of self-destruction. Tenov's interviewees sometimes report neglecting their work, or their friends, or their interests, or their hobbies, all to mold themselves into something that they think the limerent object will enjoy. Their entire well-being hangs by a whisper, or a word, or a touch, or a nod. And in such a state, they are incredibly vulnerable and often get hurt. And I want to stop for a second and recognize that if Tenov is right in this, and I probably think she is, then this is a kind of borderline irrepressible instinct, an urge that stems from deep within our somewhat animal selves, well then perhaps we ought to shift our cultural outlook towards limerence at least a little bit. If it is not evidence of aberrance, but actually a core part of the human condition, albeit not part of the universal human condition, then maybe we ought to have a little bit more patience for this seeming irrationality of the limerent person. We'll come back to this point later, but I just wanted to signpost it here because I really do think that we totally demean this mental state, and that this demonization does very little to help those in its throes. And the suffering doesn't stop there, because another limerent pattern fits perfectly into classic cycles of amorous pain. 2. Addicted to love. There are a famous series of experiments on both birds and rats, which Tenov makes reference to in her book. The experiment starts with a very simple question. What is the best way to motivate these animals? A pretty decent initial hypothesis is that the animals will be motivated more by stronger food rewards. After all, that is the rational thing to do. It is how a 20th century economist might tell you to run things. But that's not what the researchers found. Sure, the animals were motivated a little by this steady increase of rewards, but what they really responded to was unpredictable rewards. So, say the pigeon has to press a button to dispense some food. You'll get it to press the button the most amount of times by having it only dispense food some of the time in a way that the pigeon finds difficult to predict. The pigeon will then keep pressing the button long after it has become obviously irrational to do so. It's keeping alive the vain hope that this time the food will be released. They are, in effect, addicted to hope here. The idea that a reward is just around the corner solidifies their commitment to the button. We also touched upon this in my video on crushes, but Tenov points out that We humans are often really quite similar to these biohacked birds in the realm of love and limerence. Whereas if we were rational, we would expect our attraction and desire for someone would increase in pretty direct proportion to the more interest they showed in us. Tenov finds something really quite different. In many of her interviewees, the tendency was to show more attraction even in the face of marked disinterest, provided there was just enough hope to raise the possibility that one day the limerent object might show that they felt the same way. I won't dwell too much on this point because I have talked about it before, but think of the last time that you felt very strongly about someone else, but were not entirely sure that they felt the same way about you. Since their affection obviously matters to you an awful lot, this ignorance of their true feelings becomes almost unbearable. You morph into a sort of lovelorn Descartes searching for certainty amidst a whirlpool of doubt and unease. You might focus on a kind word that they spoke to you, or a smile they gave you as they walked past you in the corridor. And it's not so much that you think this is direct evidence that they definitely feel the same way about you, but it's evidence that they could feel the same way about you. It's merely securing live possibility. And so long as there is live possibility, it makes a certain sort of twisted sense to keep dwelling on and obsessing over the limerent object. As Tenov repeatedly says, while the limerent person heavily distorts reality in a number of ways, their affection still has to be grounded in the world as it appears to them. They're not totally delusional, but neither are they totally lucid. It's more like the whole world is seen through a particular interpretive lens, which seeks to answer the question, does this person feel as I do? And in the same way that a devout Christian might see questions about God reflected in all parts of the natural world and ask, how does this fit into God's plan, and is more likely to find positive answers, the limerent is constantly asking the question, what does this say about their feelings for me? And just like when we focus on any question to the exclusion of all others, they are likely to interpret mere meaningless noise as deeply significant. However, Tenov notes that there must also be sufficient doubt in the mind of the limerent to ensure maximum emotional intensity. Tenov does think that little nuggets of hope can heighten limerence, but she concurs with Stendhal that doubt similarly reels the limerent in. She outlines the specific emotional pattern in quite a lot of detail. The limerent lurches between despair and elation as they interpret various behaviors of the limerent object as either confirming their feelings or, alternatively, confirming their fears. Even worse, this means they're caught in a contradiction of desires. At once, they both wish to spend more and more time around the limerent object so that they can increase the chances of finding some hopeful signal, but at the same time, their fear means that they wish to distance themselves from the limerent object at the same time. Some of Tenov's interviewees describe intense feelings of confusion or bewilderment at what to do. Their world becomes an unsolved puzzle, and their wills become scattered in different directions, and this puts them in a semi-permanent state of unease. After all, as everyone from Marcus Aurelius to Miyamoto Musashi has pointed out, it is near impossible to find any kind of peace when your desires are pulled in two contradictory directions. These emotional highs and lows can be incredibly addictive for the limerent, and speaking from personal experience, this is definitely the case. The experience is very much reflected in the interviewees that Tenov talks to. The peaks and troughs of elation and despair cause many of them to neglect other pretty important aspects of their life, very much like someone suffering from some kind of addiction. Interviewees report neglecting their work, their family, and their friends in pursuit of their limerent object. And many even talk about pretty drastic personality changes that they underwent to make themselves more attractive to their limerent object. In hindsight, many of them recognize just how absurd this behavior was. If I had not written in this diary, I would never have believed myself capable of such long-term idiocy. But this volume provides incontrovertible proof. I can't hide my shame from myself. We largely think about this dynamic outside of relationships, where one person is pursuing the other and is hoping that this person they're not with yet will reciprocate them and a relationship will begin. But Tenov argues, and I very much agree, that the situation is likely to be even worse within a relationship, but one where one person is limerent and the other is not, or is limerent to a much lesser extent. In this case, the increased proximity is likely to make the emotional highs and lows come thick and fast. At least if someone is pining from far away, then they won't see the limerent object all the time. And in fact, long periods of distance is how many of the limerents in Tenov's book manage to let go of their feelings. We can see this dynamic in a lot of deeply unhappy relationships. We may have even experienced this ourselves. A friend of mine stayed in a deeply miserable relationship for a number of years where she felt neglected and unloved. She described knowing that she should leave, but hoping against hope that he would somehow come to reciprocate her feelings in the way and intensity that she wanted. It was pretty irrational and deeply hurtful. The irony, of course, being that until the relationship crossed over a nebulous breaking point, every casual cruelty from her partner only made her more invested because of that interplay between hope and uncertainty that we just talked about. The alienation that the limerent feels from themselves is also worth exploring here. Tenov outlined many cases of a limerent changing some aspects of their person almost in order to attract the limerent object. And this, along with the outsized importance that the limerent places on the limerent object's perception of them, implies that the limerent has come to see themselves partly, or maybe even mostly, through the eyes of the person they desire. That is, they consider the most important facts about them to be facts about the limerent object's perception of them. In effect, their sense of self becomes mediated through the eyes of this single person. In itself, your sense of self being mediated through other people's perceptions is not inherently negative. After all, we would hope that we value our partner's perceptions of us at least higher than most other people's and that we take them into account in some way. But coupled with the hot and cold dynamic that we just outlined, this suggests that the limerent won't just alternate between emotional despair and emotional ecstasy, but also between heights of self-esteem and lows of self-disgust or self-repulsion. And indeed, this is what some of Tenov's interviewees report. All of this looks very much like how many researchers describe addiction dynamics. There is the strong, involuntary urge for something that is causing significant damage to you and your life. In recent years, we have slowly expanded our conception of addiction beyond simply illicit substances and alcohol to include things like food or obscene images and sex. Tenov suggests that perhaps one helpful way to view limerence is as a rather strange addiction towards another person. There are many different factors that could exacerbate this semi-addictive tendency. Maybe if you believe someone like René Girard, then it may stem from a kind of mimetic desire. You are desiring the desire of your limerent object. If you believe someone like Jean-Paul Sartre, it may stem from some property that you personally feel that you lack, and you're thus seeking to confirm it in the judgment of a person that you are attracted to or respect, as illustrated in his play No Exit. But however you slice it, Tenov argues this is an absolutely essential part of limerence, and especially if someone is not quite as limerent about you, and especially if you are in a relationship with them, this can be an intensely difficult situation. It doesn't help that Tenov observes that limerence often actually begins to fade when we have full confidence that the limerent object feels as strongly as we do, in which case, even two people limerent about one another will struggle to find peace, as when one of their desires is too obvious, the other will at least somewhat retreat, causing despair in the temporarily more limerent party. But then if they pull away in response, as would be natural, it's likely to reel their lover back in. I think this aptly accounts for the natural push and pull dynamics that many couples have. But I actually don't think that even this goes far enough, because something that Tenov repeatedly comes back to in her book is a sort of internal limerence-seeking part of her interviewees. And I think this often ends up neglected in conversations about limerence, and indeed in conversations about love more generally. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. 3. The will to limerence. We focused an awful lot on the bad sides of limerence. I've probably titled this video something like Why You Get Hurt in Love, or Why Love Will Kick You in the Face, or something like that. But one of Tenov's overlooked observations is that many of the people she interviews want to feel limerence. In the same breath that they will talk about how a limerent attachment is borderline ruining their life, they will mention the thrilling levels of felt passion that haven't been matched since, except by potentially other limerent experiences. Tenov sometimes refers to this as a certain readiness towards limerence, and makes reference to those who are in love with love. In each case, this picks out the person whose limerence may be triggered by the presence of a limerent object, but whose causal origin, if that makes sense, probably stems from within, and that internal origin sort of seeks out an object in the world. Tenov herself actually doesn't dwell very much on this observation, but it seems to me to be incredibly important and incredibly insightful. If she's right, then although we should take into account the dynamics of a relationship when we are studying limerence, we ought to also view limerence itself as a kind of internal drive, one that seeks expression in our behavior. It actually bears a real similarity to how Nietzsche talks about the structure of human psychology. As Katsanafos puts it in his book, The Nietzschean Self, drives do not simply arise in response to external stimuli. They actively seek opportunities for expression, sometimes distorting the agent's perception of the environment in order to incline the agent to act in ways that give the drive expression. You can think what you like about this particular picture of the human mind in terms of semi-individuated drives, but the important thing for our purposes is this. We can talk about limerence as something the limerent person desires in and of itself, that is, the object of their desire. And although the more straightforward limerent object is undoubtedly important, and undoubtedly something the limerent wishes to pursue and obtain, they also, consciously or unconsciously, wish to extend, prolong, and maybe even intensify the feeling of limerence itself. This also tracks the personal experiences of many of Tenov's interviewees. A lot of them talk about how when they're not limerent about someone, life can get a bit dull. Or at the very least, they describe craving the feeling of limerence again. Even without a limerent object to attach themselves to, limerence still forms a big role in their psyche and their psychological construction. It remains a sort of force in hiding deep inside them, wishing and hoping to attach itself to a new person and thus find expression in the agent's behavior towards that person. This, again, helps to explain part of the paradoxical relationship that many of us have towards limerence, and thus why it can cause suffering within us. In effect, the relationship of the limerent with limerence mirrors the relationship between the limerent and the limerent object. They both desire limerence and are repelled by it. They recognize that being in a limerent state can cause them real harm, but they also know that very few things match the kind of high being limerent gets you. This is almost exactly the feeling of the limerent towards the limerent object that we looked at in the last section. In both cases, the limerent is caught in a painful contradiction of feeling and desire, as one powerful drive conflicts with a great many comparatively weaker drives. Again, if you don't like this image of drives, you can just think of them as wishes or desires or wants. So it's no wonder that limerence comes with such distress. The limerent is tugged in two different directions at two different levels. First, at the object level, with their relationship to the limerent object, and then at the meta level towards limerence itself. There is a long history in philosophy of thinkers arguing that desire, in some sense, seeks to perpetuate or intensify itself. Epicurus argued that learning to desire less was the key to tranquility, because to feed our desires was to grow our desires. Schopenhauer thought that the will sought many objects, but in some sense, it ultimately sought simply to continue striving, since no amount of achieving its aims would truly bring it satisfaction. Many of us have experienced this at some level, though we tend to think of it more along the lines of the hedonic treadmill. That is, as soon as we have more, we want even more. But limerence seems subtly different. The structure of limerence, whereby it declines as soon as it is properly reciprocated, suggests there is a genuine and less questionable desire on the part of the limerent to prolong their own longing. In a strange sort of way, they almost seem to lust after their own unhappiness. This may seem like a stretch, but at least introspectively, it kind of checks out. When I've been limerent in the past, if you would have asked me whether I wanted it to stop, I genuinely would have been torn. On the one hand, I often felt terrible and anxious, but on the other, it made life feel full and exciting. Limerence is perhaps one of the strongest anti-nihilistic feelings that someone could come up with. It provides your life with an emotionally resonant purpose to pursue the limerent object in every way you can. And sure, it might be pretty unpleasant, but to riff on a thought from Nietzsche, we would often rather will something self-destructive than not will at all. I think this helps explain partly why people tend to fall into limerence over and over again, despite the knowledge that it can often end relatively badly. And I also think that this is one of the final parts of the puzzle as to why limerence makes love so painful. It is because, however much we might try to escape it, there is a part of us that wants it to pull us back in. Even those among Tenov's interviewees who say they have sworn off limerence often also say that they miss it, or they talk about it in vaguely wistful tones. They say that their new loves are stable and in many ways healthier, and they may talk about all the suffering that they went through in the throes of limerence, but at the same time, they are candid that their emotions are not stimulated in quite the same way as they were with their limerent objects. Limerence is often demonized as an emotional state, and it's easy to see why. It can make us behave irrationally, it distracts us from other, seemingly more important things, and when we have a clear head, it often just seems completely ridiculous. But it is so compelling, partly because, to use a cliched phrase, when it's good, it is so good. If we just view limerence as a totally negative state, then, I think ironically, we'll both miss its positive sides, but also its most insidious aspects. People don't just lust after limerence because of the suffering it causes them. It's because of all the pleasure it causes them as well. In the right setting, with the right person, and some conscious planning, I don't see why limerence couldn't be transformed from primarily a source of great pain to a source of great pleasure. In her book, Mating in Captivity, Esther Perel uses her many years' experience as a couples therapist to discuss all the ways we can keep desire alive in long-term relationships. And many of her strategies, like placing temporary barriers between you and your partner, or finding out ways of seeing them in new and unfamiliar situations, even situations where they might attract the romantic attention of someone else, seem to be about harnessing sort of limerent dynamics for the benefit of a long-term partnership. Tenov persuasively argues that we have historically taken a rather dim view on limerence, and that this was quite unfair of us. I broadly agree with this assessment. However, at least in this book, Tenov seems to also view limerence as just sort of a fact of life, something that will simply happen to us and we will deal with it when it comes. But I think both of these attitudes seem to leave something important out, or they seem to miss an opportunity. If limerence is so very powerful, and I certainly don't doubt that it is, why don't we think about how to harness it, or use it, or sublimate it in some way? 4. A limerence for life. As I was reading Tenov's book, it struck me that there are quite a few mirror images to romantic limerence that occur in other non-romantic aspects of life. So much so that maybe we can usefully group them together at least some of the time. As far as I can tell, the key causal factor in the development and intensification of limerence is that seesawing between hope and doubt that we discussed earlier, coupled with a pre-existing attraction towards the limerent object. And thinking on this, I came up with a number of other situations where this general pattern manifested itself, although, as I said, outside of the romantic context. An old friend of mine had a very close brush with death in her childhood. She developed a rare form of cancer. In a conversation one day, she mentioned being resigned to her death for months as a child. She didn't know when it would come, but she was certain that it would indeed come. But in a stroke of, well, sheer statistical abnormality, she received the news that her treatment had been unusually effective and that she was almost certainly going to live. She described a feeling that I can only describe as a limerence for life. It was beyond simple gratitude. It was borderline ecstasy. It seemed like nothing else mattered to her except for the mere fact that she would continue existing. This feeling is corroborated by so many others who have recovered from an illness that they assumed would be fatal. Having nearly seen life slip between their fingers, they are absolutely thrilled just to grasp it once more. Of course, these initial ecstatic feelings fade as life becomes simply the backdrop to the things that occur within life. But it struck me that this was structurally very similar to limerence. In this case, something that was deemed to be safe, at least for the time being, life, was temporarily put into doubt, and then hope was restored by the recovery. And this got me thinking. We recognize that there are ways we can sort of redirect other supposedly unhelpful emotions towards more helpful ends. Like many people, when I get frustrated by something, I often go to the gym and I work off that frustration by lifting things and then putting them down again many times in a Sisyphean display of blowing off steam. We put people in anger management classes to teach them more productive ways to control and repurpose the energy they get from anger. So, why can't we do the same with limerence and limerence-related states? Now, I'm not entirely sure what the exact route forward here is. It took an awful long time for us to develop empirically supported techniques to redirect and manage anger, and it may take a similar level of time and effort to do so with limerence. But my worry is that if we think the only way to deal with limerence is to eliminate it in the name of preserving our peace, then we're leaving an incredibly powerful motivating force on the table, one that, for all of its downsides, makes feeling nihilistic basically impossible. As we've touched upon a few times, we do have a tendency to really contrast limerence with love. We view limerence as the ugly younger cousin of love, an emotion far less worthy of respect and far less mature than its ever-glorified counterpart. But if, as Tenov argues, it is to a large extent unavoidable, and so any talk of eliminating it entirely is just idle, shouldn't we think about ways to use it, and use it not just in the romantic sphere, but outside of it as well? The best example of this limerence outside romance that I can think of is Franz Kafka. Kafka's journals and letters constantly document a borderline limerent relationship with his own writing. One day he is sure of his abilities and absolutely confident he can produce excellent work, and in the next letter he is filled with doubt or despair. His passion for writing is incredibly evident, and it seems like that passion is at least partly the result of this cycle of hope and doubt, just like in the case of the limerent. I should also mention here that this clearly did cause him both intense distress and intense elation. I'm sure that we would call Kafka an unhealthy obsessive today, but he really did write phenomenal books. Now, I'm not recommending that we start mimicking Kafka in our pursuits or our emotional management. As much as I personally am grateful that he tortured himself to the point of brilliance, I don't think that it is a good universal model for human well-being. I'm instead thinking of something a bit more like the controlled stimulation of a more gentle form of limerence, similar to what we looked at in the last section regarding what Esther Perel encourages in some of her clients, but in this case in a non-romantic domain. Obviously, this would take a lot more thinking to work out in detail, but I just want to give you one example of something that I mean. The ancient Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca used to occasionally distance himself from most or all of his worldly possessions, either in imagination or in reality, in order to reassure himself that he could live perfectly well without them. This is part of the general Stoic program of learning not to value so-called indifference. However, when I occasionally try limited versions of this exercise for short periods, I find that another feeling is there as well. I am really excited to return to what only a few days ago I viewed as mundane. By placing this thing beyond my reach, I realized how much I truly valued and truly enjoyed it. Take my reading, for example. I genuinely love reading, and even when I have the odd day off, I normally find that I'd spend it reading anyway. But as an experiment to deal with my sort of underlying tendency towards workaholism, I decided to distance myself from my books for a few days. I banned myself from reading. And to be honest, it was an absolute pain in the ass. This wasn't like taking a technology break where I was distancing myself from something that I enjoy but ultimately don't value all that highly. This was something that I both get direct pleasure from and value intensely. Anyway, I can't say that I particularly enjoyed the few days. I was quite antsy for most of it, and I didn't achieve the kind of inner tranquility that Seneca had promised me. But I did find myself feeling something like limerence, but about reading. I could barely sleep the night before the ban was lifted because I was just so excited to be able to read again. I mean, I enjoy reading in my day-to-day life, but normally not that much. And it did have a temporary but relatively enduring effect. It was short to medium term, and it sort of resembled the feeling that the couples in Perel's book felt towards their partner after they had seen them in a new context or seen them be hit on by another person. In effect, I had had a taste of what life felt like without something that I really enjoyed and really valued, and that activated something like a fear of loss. And this in turn, temporarily at least, strengthened my passion for the valued object, or in this case, the valued activity. Of course, this was not a perfect experiment. For one thing, the ban was self-imposed, and to that extent it was an artificial barrier that I could have removed at any time. But it did illustrate something that I remain gently convinced of, that the structure of the limerent experience may sometimes be replicated to some extent outside of romance just by mimicking some of the same push and pull dynamics that characterizes limerence itself. Though, of course, this is an anecdote, so it's just a sample size of one, but let me know how you get on if you decide to try it. So, despite this being a speculative and tentative conclusion, I would like to suggest a slightly different attitude to limerence, both in the narrow romantic sense and this wider sense, from both the staunch moralist who condemns it and Tenov, who seems to view it as a fact of life. Perhaps this is just a pipe dream, but I think we shouldn't let such a powerful and vital psychological force go unexplored and unharnessed. I sincerely hope that one day we can look back on all of the thinking and writing that we've done so far on limerence and see not primarily a source of despair or a neutral fact, but instead a wellspring of strength that we as individuals can slowly learn to draw from. Now, I confess that I don't know if such a thing is possible, although I do think that some of Esther Perel's redirections of limerence seems to suggest it might be, at least in romance. But I do hope that it is in other domains. And I do think that we have tentative reasons for at least considering that we can, albeit indirectly, direct limerence a little more than we initially thought. And I don't think that we should underestimate just how incredible that could be. But if you want another video on love, I have a breakdown of some of the problems that I think love faces in the modern age right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.